Crockett by calling her Ghetto turned into a national firestorm. Inside a packed congressional hearing, one word exposed centuries of buried injustice, and Jasmine didn't flinch. Millions of Americans watched as she flipped humiliation into history. This wasn't just a political argument. It became a turning point for racial justice that changed a whole generation. How did one woman's courage turn a single insult into a battle cry for millions? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing room wasn't just full, it was loaded like a powder keg, ready to explode. Every seat behind the long, oak table was occupied, and a second ring of spectators lined the walls, buzzing with anticipation just beneath a taut surface of silence. The banners behind the dais proclaimed the noble cause, budget oversight for social investment. But everyone present knew the real battle would be over much more than numbers. C-SPAN's red light flickered on, CNN's crew whispered frantic, last-minute instructions into headsets, and Fox News cameras zoomed in, hunting for the first crack in the facade. Jasmine Crockett adjusted the lapel of her dark blue suit, every motion crisp, her expression carved from granite. She was a portrait of calm, but her eyes burned with the fire of someone who knew how much injustice still rotted beneath the marble floors. Across the table, Lauren Boebert slapped a heavy folder onto the polished wood with a thud that drew several heads her way. Her lips curled into the kind of smirk that promised chaos, not compromise. Boebert's fingers drummed the cover of her documents, numbers, graphs, talking points designed to weaponize stereotypes, and her eyes gleamed with the reckless confidence of someone who believed the cameras were her shield. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, the air thick enough to slice, as history prepared to tear through the chamber like a runaway train. Jasmine inhaled once, deeply, knowing that before this day was over, every word would either build a bridge or set the house on fire. The silence snapped like a cable under strain as Lauren Boebert seized the microphone with the energy of someone itching for a fight, her voice slicing into the tension like a blade drawn in a crowded room. Boebert leaned forward, her knuckles whitening against the sleek black stem of the microphone, her voice sharp and deliberate, calibrated for maximum impact. "We are bleeding taxpayer dollars into bottomless pits," she began, her words punching through the room with cruel precision, "wasting hard-earned money on programs that reward failure instead of fostering responsibility." The words landed like hammer blows, aimed not just at budgets or policies, but at entire communities sitting silently in the crosshairs. She flicked her folder open, yanking out a chart filled with red slashes and doomsday arrows, waving it as if it were evidence of some hidden national crime. "Billions," she spat, her tone dripping disdain, "poured into so-called revitalization efforts in ghettos." She paused, savoring the word, letting it hang in the air like smoke from a dirty fire. A low, almost imperceptible gasp moved through the room, but Boebert either didn't hear it or didn't care. Her lips curled into something between a sneer and a smile, as if daring anyone to challenge her. And in that charged, electric instant, it became clear. This was not a debate about policy. It was a battle for dignity itself. Emboldened by the heavy silence, Boebert pressed her advantage, her voice sharpening into something that felt more like a weapon than an argument. She leaned closer to the microphone, the sleeves of her fitted jacket pulling tight around her arms, a physical reflection of the tension she was winding tighter with every word. "The truth is," she said slowly, savoring each syllable as if she were reading out a verdict, "these ghetto communities need to stop expecting handouts and start learning how to stand on their own 2 feet." The word ghetto didn't just slip out. It struck, brutal and intentional, each letter carrying the weight of a history too often buried beneath political slogans. It hit the air like a slap, raw and ringing, sending an invisible shockwave across the hearing room. Faces stiffened, hands twitched toward pens and phones, as aides and staffers instinctively sensed the ground shifting under them. For a split second, the room seemed to shrink, walls pressing inward, chandeliers stabbing the air with hard, merciless light. Cameras zoomed in, lenses narrowing like the eyes of predators catching the scent of blood. Boebert, emboldened by the crackling tension, mistook the stunned silence for compliance. Her smile grew colder, teeth flashing as if she had scored a point. She rapped her knuckles lightly against the folder before her, punctuating her words with a steady rhythm, but her audience had already changed. No one was looking at the charts or the graphs she brandished. No one cared about the numbers anymore. Every heartbeat in the room had shifted, magnetized toward the slur she had detonated without blinking, toward the insult that had slipped past the boundaries of debate and punched deep into the bone of history. The insult still hung in the air like the lingering smoke of a battlefield cannon. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch, did not blink, did not even breathe harder, as if the weight of 1,000 such moments had already forged her into steel. Jasmine did not rise. She did not fire back. Instead, she stayed perfectly still, the calm center of a gathering storm, as if anchoring herself against the tide of centuries-old contempt that had just been unleashed yet again. Her eyes, deep and unblinking, locked onto Boebert's across the expanse of the table. Not with fury, but with something colder, more formidable, a patience sharpened into a blade. One of the C-SPAN cameras caught the moment with brutal clarity, zooming in until the frame held nothing but Jasmine's face, carved from stone, and her gaze, a silent, merciless indictment. Around her, the vast hearing room seemed to collapse into a vacuum, sucking every sound, every whisper, every restless shuffle into a suffocating silence. Even the chandeliers above seemed frozen mid-glitter, as if light itself dared not move. Among the spectators, black men and women who had come to bear witness to yet another debate over their worth sat rigid, their hands clenched tight in their laps, their bodies remembering battles far older than this day. No one spoke. No one dared. The air itself seemed to quiver, strained to the breaking point, waiting for the moment when Jasmine Crockett would finally choose to unleash what the room and the world so desperately needed to hear. The silence had stretched to its breaking point, and as the nation seemed to hold its breath, Jasmine Crockett moved, not in anger, not in haste, but with the deliberate gravity of someone who understood exactly what this moment demanded. Her chair slid back with a sound that seemed louder than a gunshot in the choking quiet, and she rose slowly, her movements measured, almost ritualistic, like a general stepping onto a battlefield, already soaked with the blood of those who had come before her. Her back was straight, her shoulders square, every line of her body declaring a defiance so profound that it needed no shouting to be heard. She didn't reach for notes. She didn't adjust her microphone. She stood exactly as she was, unadorned, unshielded, and unafraid. When she spoke, her voice came low, almost quiet, but sharpened to a point so fine it sliced through the air like a scalpel. Every syllable was precise, every pause carved out with the weight of 1,000 silences swallowed by generations before her. "The word ghetto," she said, and for a moment the word itself seemed to tremble against her lips. Not from weakness, but from the raw, terrible power it carried, "is not just a word." Her gaze, cool and unwavering, locked on Boebert first, and then moved slowly across the panel, making sure no one escaped what she was about to say. "It is a weapon, forged in prejudice, sharpened by fear, and wielded against those who dared to hope for something more." Her words rolled out not in anger, but with a solemnity that made the marble pillars seem to lean closer to listen. "It was used to cage our bodies, to erase our futures, to bury our dreams under concrete and barbed wire. It was used to tell us where we could live, where we could work, what we were worth, and when we were not worth saving." Each sentence struck with a heavy finality, like the slow, relentless tolling of a funeral bell. No one moved. No one dared interrupt the truth now hanging in the heavy air, thick enough to choke on. Somewhere in the room, a young black intern pressed a trembling hand to their chest. Somewhere else, a camera operator wiped a sudden tear away with the back of their hand, trying to pretend it was just a trick of the lights. Jasmine stood unmoved, her voice steady, her heart burning, but controlled, like a flame that had been tended carefully for centuries, passed down from hands calloused by chains and prayers whispered into dark, unyielding nights. In that moment, she was not speaking just for herself. She was speaking for every ancestor locked behind invisible walls, for every child told they would never escape them, for every dream that had been fenced in by the casual cruelty of a word. She didn't shout. She didn't pound the table. Jasmine Crockett wielded something far sharper than volume. She wielded the weight of unvarnished truth, dragging it into the cold fluorescent light where no one could pretend not to see it. Her voice dipped lower, a slow, relentless current pulling everyone in, drowning out even the hum of the cameras. In America, she said, her words slicing through the marble air, ghettos didn't rise because people failed. They rose because America needed them to exist. She let that first cut sink in before she moved, steady and merciless, through the history few dared to speak aloud. Banks drew red lines on maps, literal red lines, and declared that no loans, no insurance, no dreams would ever cross into black neighborhoods. Her eyes scanned the room, daring anyone to deny it, but no one moved. Covenants written into law barred families like mine from owning homes in good communities, from sitting in the same classrooms, from drinking from the same fountains. Her voice sharpened further, each word a blow against the great wall of national amnesia. Highways were built, not around black neighborhoods, but straight through them, carving our communities apart like meat under a butcher's blade, labeled as urban renewal, while we lost everything we had ever built. She paused only long enough to let the image settle. A landscape of churches bulldozed, homes reduced to dust, futures paved over by indifference. When we fought for better schools, we were given promises and broken funding. When we fought for food, for health care, for a shred of what others took for granted, we were met with silence, or worse, with scorn. The hearing room had shrunk now, the oxygen thinning, as if the building itself could not bear the weight of what it was being forced to remember. Jasmine's hands stayed loose at her sides, but the entire room could feel the force radiating off her. Decades, no, centuries of betrayal compressed into a single voice, a single moment that refused to be sanitized or softened. Ghettos were engineered, she said, her voice now a low drum beat echoing through every heart in the chamber. To hold us down, to pen us in, to turn hope into hunger and brilliance into begging. Her words weren't just spoken. They seemed to be carved into the stone around them, etched into the wood of the long table, burning themselves into the lenses of the cameras recording it all. Somewhere in the back, an aide gripped their pen so tightly it snapped. In the front row, a reporter lowered her camera, unable to keep her hands from trembling. And still Jasmine stood, not as a victim, but as a witness and a warrior, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 silenced cries that had never made it into history books. Every eye in the room was on her now, not in pity, not in polite discomfort, but in the stunned, helpless recognition that for the first time in a long time, the truth was not being negotiated or debated. It was simply standing there, alive, undeniable, and far too powerful to ever be shoved back into the dark again. But the truth, once unleashed, had a way of making even the boldest blusterers stumble. And as Jasmine's words continued to hang heavy in the air, Boebert found herself scrambling for higher ground that no longer existed beneath her feet. She shifted in her seat, an awkward, jerking movement that betrayed the first crack splitting her carefully rehearsed facade. Her fingers tightened around the microphone as if she could squeeze control back into her hands by sheer force. "I wasn't," she started, her voice pitched too high, too fast, brittle as dry wood about to snap. "I wasn't trying to insult anyone," she rushed on, throwing glances to her own side of the aisle, as if searching for invisible reinforcements that weren't coming. "All I meant was, people have to take responsibility for themselves," she said, her tone teetering between defiant and defensive. Too eager, too hollow. A thin, nervous laugh escaped her lips, landing with a dead thud in the thick, charged silence that now felt like a living thing pressing down on the room. She tried again, digging herself deeper. It's about work ethic, about pulling yourself up, you know?" Boebert added, her voice cracking slightly at the edges, as if even she could hear how badly the words were failing her. "We can't keep throwing money at problems and expect them to fix themselves," she insisted, but her smile faltered, flickering in and out like a dying light bulb. Across the room, faces turned away in open disgust. Some lawmakers leaned back in their chairs as if recoiling from the stench of something rotten set loose. The first low ripple of protest rose from the Democratic side, a murmur growing louder, angrier, impossible to dismiss. "Shameful," someone hissed through clenched teeth. "Disgraceful," snapped another voice from the back, loud enough to ripple through the room like a jolt of electricity. Boebert's eyes darted toward the committee chair, but no lifeline was offered. Her smile, a smug, practiced smirk that usually played well to friendly cameras, twisted now into something raw, more desperate, a grimace caught halfway between arrogance and fear. She opened her mouth as if to say more, but the weight of the silence crashing down around her made even words feel like a betrayal she could not afford. She was no longer the provocateur setting the terms of battle. She was the cornered figure, bleeding credibility by the second, as the storm she had summoned began to break over her head. The blood was already in the water, but Jasmine Crockett didn't lunge. She moved with the slow, terrifying precision of someone who knew that real power didn't shout. It cornered. Jasmine took a single step forward, not enough to seem aggressive, but just enough to tighten the noose. Jasmine's voice stayed low, steady, each word carving through the air with the precision of a surgeon. She tilted her head slightly, repeating the phrase Boebert had flung so carelessly. Personal responsibility? Her gaze locked onto Boebert's, unblinking, merciless, dragging her out from behind the crumbling wall of excuses she had tried to build. "You dare preach about responsibility," Jasmine said, her tone sharpening with every syllable. "Inside a system designed, engineered, to bind us at birth?" The chamber seemed to contract. The polished wood, the marble columns, even the stale artificial light closing in around the woman who had fired the first shot and was now flailing to survive the counterattack. Boebert opened her mouth to answer, but no sound came. Jasmine's words had filled the space so completely there was no room left for lies. "How do you take responsibility for red lines drawn by hands you'll never see?" Jasmine pressed, her tone cutting deeper, louder now but still terrifyingly controlled. "How do you work harder when every door is nailed shut before you're old enough to reach the handle?" The questions pummeled the room like a slow, deliberate drumbeat of indictment, not only against Boebert, but against the country itself. And Jasmine stood there unmoving, a force of history made flesh, daring the world to look away, and knowing it couldn't. And Jasmine, sensing the exact moment when truth could break bone, drove deeper, pulling no punches, stacking fact upon fact like iron against Boebert's paper-thin defenses. Her voice remained low, controlled, but each word landed heavier, as if she were nailing planks into the coffin of Boebert's argument. "In education," Jasmine began, her tone deadly calm, "Black students are still 3 times more likely to attend schools without basic resources, without functioning libraries, without up-to-date textbooks, without access to advanced coursework that their white peers receive as a given." She paused, letting the brutal inequity settle over the room like a slow, suffocating fog. In 2023, majority Black school districts received an average of $2,200 less per student than majority white districts, every single year per child. She shifted slightly, just enough to make Boebert flinch without touching her. "In housing," Jasmine continued, relentless, "even today, Black applicants are rejected for home loans at rates 80% higher than white applicants, even when their incomes, credit scores, and employment histories are identical." She said the last word with a precision that made the panel of lawmakers visibly tense. Generations of families locked out of wealth building because of redlining, because of federally sanctioned discrimination, not laziness, not irresponsibility. Her voice sharpened, becoming colder, cleaner, like a blade honed too long. "And in the workplace," Jasmine pressed, refusing to give Boebert a second of air to regroup. "Resume with Black-sounding names, Letitia, Jamal, Deshaun, are still 50% less likely to get a call back than ones with names like Emily or Brandon." A shudder ran through the crowd, not dramatic, not loud, but a ripple of unbearable recognition for those who knew exactly what she meant. Not because the qualifications are different, not because the work ethic is different, but because the game was rigged before we were even allowed to sit at the table. Jasmine let her gaze drift slowly over the chamber, her silence more cutting than any shout could ever have been. She could feel it, the silent panic blooming in those who realized she wasn't just indicting Lauren Boebert. She was indicting an entire scaffolding of polite, institutionalized cruelty that people had built their comfortable lives upon. And she wasn't finished yet. Not even close. As Jasmine's words hammered down like a relentless storm, all eyes turned to Boebert, searching for a defense. But what they found instead was the unmistakable crumble of a mask too thin to survive the truth. Boebert sat frozen for a moment, her hands twitching slightly atop her pile of disheveled notes, as if unsure whether to reach for them or shove them away. Her mouth opened once, then closed again, the instinct to fight back visibly wrestling with the dawning horror that no weapon she possessed could match the force now bearing down on her. She tried to laugh it off at first, a weak, strangled sound that barely made it past her lips and died pitifully in the thick, electric silence. Her face, once flushed with righteous fury, paled under the weight of the numbers, the names, the realities she could no longer outrun. I think you're twisting what I said, she muttered at last, her voice thin, defensive, clinging to the wreckage of an argument that had already been obliterated. But the words fell like feathers against a brick wall, powerless, irrelevant. Boebert's eyes darted across the room, desperate for some lifeline. A nod, a smirk, a shared sneer. But all she found were stone faces and cameras that refused to blink. The shield of performance politics had shattered, and beneath it, she was smaller, exposed, painfully human in a way that showed just how hollow her posturing had been. She adjusted her microphone with a trembling hand, but the sound screeched against the silence, making her flinch again, another crack widening for everyone to see. And sitting across from her, Jasmine Crockett did not smile, did not move. She simply waited, the embodiment of a truth too heavy for Boebert to carry and too late for her to escape. The walls of the hearing room could barely contain the explosion Jasmine had ignited. And before Boebert could even fully gather her breath, the wildfire had already begun to consume the nation outside. The first clips hit the internet within minutes, raw, unedited, cutting straight through the noise like a siren in a dead city. A 22-second video of Jasmine Crockett standing tall, her voice slicing through the stale rhetoric with lethal precision, racked up 10,000 views before the hearing even adjourned. Another clip, tighter, angrier, Jasmine's hand slicing the air as she demanded to know how a child was supposed to work harder when every door was bolted shut, exploded across Twitter, Instagram, TikTok simultaneously, a synchronized eruption of digital fire. On Twitter, it took just 17 minutes for hashtag Ghetto Pride to start trending nationally. Within the hour, it was #1 worldwide. Users from Harlem to Oakland to Chicago flooded timelines with Jasmine's words, weaving her fierce stance into memes, into remixes, into slogans burning hotter with every repost. Someone looped her line, a system designed to bind us at birth, over a beat that dropped like a hammer, and the track spread like an anthem through communities starving for someone, anyone, to say what they had been screaming into the void for generations. A second hashtag, Crockett clapback, surged up alongside it, a tribute to the surgical way she had dismantled Boebert's smirking cruelty. People posted side-by-side screenshots, Boebert shrinking in her chair, Jasmine rising like a force of nature in heels and a navy blue suit. Others quoted her statistics on redlining and education, pairing them with personal stories. Stories of denied loans, of segregated schools, of resumes sent into black holes. She didn't just speak for herself, one post read, retweeted more than 300,000 times. She dragged the entire history of injustice into that room and dared America to look her in the eye. In barbershops in Atlanta, in diners in Detroit, in churches in Baltimore, televisions replayed the confrontation on loop. CNN ran it on primetime. MSNBC broke down her statistics with awestruck panels of experts. Even Fox News, trying desperately to spin the narrative, couldn't avoid showing the moment Jasmine's voice cracked through the facade of political theater like a battering ram. Their anchors grimaced, danced around the edges. But the footage was too raw, too real, too unstoppable to suppress. On TikTok, young Black creators stitched her speech into new forms. Spoken word performances, dance routines, even mock history lessons, where Jasmine's words played as the soundtrack while old maps of red-line cities burned slowly on screen. A 15-year-old girl from New Orleans posted a tear-streaked video, clutching her phone and whispering, "I've never seen someone say it like that before. I didn't know we were allowed to say it like that." Her video hit 1 million views overnight. At the grassroots level, something began to stir that no politician, no talking head could engineer or control. Students printed Jasmine's quotes onto t-shirts, selling out local shops in under an hour. Churches added her words into Sunday sermons, pastors thundering her indictment of a system built to suffocate into packed sanctuaries. Teachers, especially those in struggling public schools, shared her testimony with their classes, using it to spark the kinds of honest conversations that had too long been buried under politeness and fear. Black elders, some who had marched in the 60s and others who had quietly borne the daily humiliations that never made headlines, watched Jasmine's steady, unblinking face and nodded. They knew that stance. They recognized that fire. It was the same look they had carried through bus boycotts, sit-ins, segregated courtrooms. A look that said, "I am tired of asking for dignity. I am here to claim it." Meanwhile, Lauren Boebert's name trended for entirely different reasons. Screenshots of her frozen, cornered face flooded the internet, paired with captions that needed no embellishment: exposed, outmatched, silenced. Her supporters tried to spin it as liberal bullying, but even many on the right quietly admitted she hadn't just lost an argument, she had been annihilated. No viral slogan, no carefully edited clip could reverse the rawness of the beating she had endured under the harsh lights of truth. Across Black America, and increasingly beyond it, a current of something electric pulsed through the veins of a people long told to wait, to be patient, to soften the truth until it no longer threatened anyone. That current was not anger. It was not even pride in the usual sense. It was power. Raw, aching, long-denied power, stirring like a sleeping giant under the weight of centuries. For too long, ghetto had been used as a chain, a slur, a cage. Tonight it had been transformed into a banner, not of shame, but of survival. A declaration that despite every brick thrown, every door slammed shut, every system rigged against them, Black America was still standing, still fighting, still capable of producing warriors who could walk into the halls of power and dare to tell the unvarnished truth without fear. And Jasmine Crockett, one woman with a voice sharpened by generations of silence, had not just confronted a congresswoman. She had shattered a wall. She had shown an entire generation that dignity did not require permission, and that survival itself was not something to apologize for. It was something to lift up like a torch. Even as night fell across Washington, even as the marble columns of the Capitol cast long, ghostly shadows over empty streets, the echoes of her words refused to die. They ricocheted across screens and streets and hearts, gathering strength with every telling. Jasmine hadn't merely trended. She hadn't merely gone viral. She had reminded a nation, some in pride, others in shame, that the ghetto was never about broken people. It was about a broken promise. And tonight, under 1,000 blinking screens lighting up the dark, that promise had been called out. Loud, clear, and utterly, gloriously unignorable. But the wildfire Jasmine ignited didn't stop at the edges of social media. It roared straight through the marble corridors of Congress itself, forcing those who had long hidden behind silence to choose a side they could no longer pretend didn't exist. The next morning, the halls of the Capitol were not just busy. They were vibrating with a tension so sharp it felt like the air itself might tear apart. Reporters lined the stairways and corridors, their cameras drawn like weapons, their microphones thrust toward anyone who so much as glanced in Jasmine Crockett's direction. Yet it wasn't just the press that buzzed. It was the politicians themselves, moving in tight, frantic clusters, whispering behind folders, darting into private offices like soldiers seeking bunkers before a bomb hit. The Democrats moved first. Representative Jackson Lee, her voice rich with fury and authority, stood outside the chamber doors and demanded what half the nation was already screaming from their living rooms, that Lauren Boebert must apologize publicly and unequivocally. This was not a misstatement, she declared to the forest of cameras. This was the weaponization of a centuries-old slur aimed not just at one woman, but at an entire community that has fought too long and bled too much to be dismissed as ghetto. Her words hit like hammer blows, and behind her, a growing line of Democratic lawmakers stood grim-faced, nodding in silent, searing agreement. Inside closed rooms, tempers flared hotter. Some Democratic members drafted formal letters of censure. Others threatened to walk out of committee hearings unless an apology was issued. Staffers raced to schedule emergency meetings. Black caucus members convened behind heavy oak doors, their voices rising in fractured snippets of outrage and heartbreak. This wasn't just another political fight. This was an old wound split wide open on the floor of the people's house. Meanwhile, on the Republican side, the reactions were splintered and far uglier. A handful of Boebert's staunchest allies rushed to defend her, clumsily reciting talking points about free speech and misinterpretations that sounded thinner with every repetition. Representative Gosar, face tight and pale, insisted on Fox News that this was just another example of Democrats playing the race card, his words brittle, desperate, unconvincing even to his own staffers who exchanged pained glances behind the cameras. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene went further, tweeting that Boebert had been brave to stand up against liberal race hustlers, a comment that ignited its own firestorm of backlash within minutes. But far more telling was the silence. Dozens of Republican members, usually loud and unbothered, vanished into their offices, refusing interviews, declining comment, their absence screaming louder than any defense could have. Walking through the Capitol, the shift was palpable. Lawmakers who once greeted Boebert with easy smiles now offered stiff nods or avoided her entirely. She moved through the halls like a shadow, her usual swagger replaced with a brittle tightness, her eyes flicking from face to face, searching for loyalty and finding precious little. The fractures ran deeper than party lines. Veteran Republicans, those who had survived scandals, elections, and cultural firestorms, recognized what was happening with a sick clarity. This wasn't just another news cycle. Jasmine Crockett had cracked open something too large, too real, too deeply embedded in the American psyche to be buried under spin. Boebert hadn't just made a gaffe, she had exposed an infection, and now the entire institution was bleeding. On the floor of the House, debates that had once been about budgets and bills suddenly bristled with a new electric subtext. Words like equity, historical injustice, and systemic racism were no longer confined to footnotes and side conversations. They stormed onto the record, raw and unvarnished. Lawmakers who had once prided themselves on bipartisanship found themselves forced to pick a side, not in the abstract, but here, now in front of the cameras and the American people. And outside the Capitol, the ripple effects multiplied into tidal waves. Editorials flooded every major newspaper. The New York Times ran a stark headline, "From the Ghetto to the Capitol, Jasmine Crockett forces a reckoning." The Washington Post published a front-page story chronicling the racial history of housing discrimination, connecting Boebert's slur to a legacy most Americans preferred to ignore. MSNBC aired a primetime town hall titled "Still Fighting for the American Dream," while CNN invited Jasmine herself onto their most-watched morning show, her voice shaking millions awake over their coffee. Even corporate America, so often slow and calculating in its responses, began issuing statements. Major banks posted graphics about supporting underserved communities. Universities scrambled to highlight diversity initiatives. Brands slapped number ghetto pride onto sanitized marketing campaigns that few bought into. But it didn't matter. The center had shifted. The fire had caught. The question wasn't whether you would react. It was how you would be judged for your silence if you didn't. And in the midst of it all, the deeper truth blazed hotter than ever. This was never about one word. It was about the architecture of injustice, about the comfortable myths that allowed good people to turn away from bad systems, about the ways respectability politics had long muted righteous rage into polite requests that went unheard. Jasmine Crockett had not simply confronted Lauren Boebert, she had detonated a charge at the base of that rotted structure. She had forced a nation to peer into the mirror and see not a country past its demons, but a country still shackled by them, sometimes in law, sometimes in silence, but always relentlessly in the lives it destroyed. And though many scrambled to contain the fallout, it was far too late. The genie was out of the bottle. The old normal had been scorched into ash. In church halls and school auditoriums, in city council meetings from Atlanta to Milwaukee, Americans weren't just talking about Boebert's insult. They were talking about hiring discrimination, housing injustice, school segregation. They were talking about systems that punish blackness long before anyone uttered a word. This was no longer a footnote, no longer a side conversation. It was the conversation. And at its center, standing calm against the rising storm, was Jasmine Crockett. Unbowed, unwavering, and utterly unwilling to let America forget the cost of pretending that history was truly history. With the whole nation watching, the echoes of 1,000 past injustices pressing down on the marble walls. Jasmine Crockett rose, not just as one woman, but as the living, breathing answer to centuries of silence, and began to speak. The chamber was packed to the walls, a rare thing in a city that usually slept through its own ceremonies. Every seat filled, reporters jammed shoulder to shoulder behind the brass railings, their cameras blinking like mechanical heartbeats. Senior lawmakers leaned forward at their desks, some with hands clasped tight to hide their unease, others openly wary, as if they sensed they were about to be placed not just on the wrong side of history, but on the wrong side of decency itself. Jasmine Crockett stood alone at the center podium, a small figure against the sweeping backdrop of American flags, marble columns, and glittering chandeliers. Yet she owned the room in a way few had ever done. No yelling, no theatrics. Just the sheer gravitational pull of someone who had been told 1,000 times to sit down and had chosen, instead, to rise. She gripped the edges of the podium, not to steady herself, but to anchor the room to her, to the truth she was about to release like a seismic shock. For a heartbeat, she said nothing, letting the silence grow so dense it began to suffocate even the most practiced politicians. Then in a voice low, steady, but carrying the weight of a people too long dismissed, she spoke. "Ghetto," she said, and the words snapped through the air like a whip. "Ghetto is not a crime." Somewhere a chair creaked loudly as someone shifted, uncomfortable already. Jasmine's eyes swept the chamber, not pleading, not challenging, simply daring them to look away. No one did. It is not a character flaw. It is not a choice. It is not a curse. Her voice sharpened, each sentence dropping like a hammer onto the collective conscience of the room. It is the consequence of decisions made far from our homes, far from our voices, decisions wrapped in laws, in policies, in polite language that hid the brutality underneath. The room held still, the kind of stillness that only truth could carve. Jasmine's hands remained steady, but her heart thundered, not from fear, but from the unstoppable surge of every ancestor who had ever prayed for this day. We, those of us boxed into that word, judged by it, punished by it, are not the broken ones. Her voice grew deeper, richer, gathering force like a storm building out at sea. We are the builders. We are the hands that laid the bricks of this nation. We are the backs that bent beneath its weight. We are the hearts that refused to stop beating, even when every system, every law, every whispered slur told us we were expendable. A murmur ran through the gallery now, a ripple of barely contained emotion. Jasmine pressed forward, relentless, unstoppable. You call us ghetto because you don't want to admit what this country has done to us. You call us ghetto because you need to believe we failed ourselves instead of confronting how you stack the deck. Her gaze pinned Boebert, pinned every silent enabler in the room, holding them in place like insects under glass. We were herded into ghettos by zoning boards, by mortgage lenders, by school districts that decided before we were even born what futures we were allowed to dream of. Jasmine's voice rose, not a shout, but a crescendo, the sound of a truth finally unleashed without apology. We survived those ghettos. We fought for our dignity inside walls you built to contain us. We raised families. We built businesses. We created culture so powerful the world tried to steal it, even as it despised the people who birthed it. She paused, letting that sink in, every heartbeat in the room ticking louder against the walls of denial now crumbling around them. And still, she said, her voice dropping again into something softer, but infinitely more devastating. You dare to act as if we should apologize for surviving the very conditions you imposed. The air grew thick, charged, as if the chandeliers themselves might come crashing down under the unbearable gravity of the moment. Some Republican lawmakers stared at their desks, refusing to meet her eyes. Others, like Boebert, tried to harden their faces into masks of indifference, but the masks were slipping, cracking at the edges. Jasmine inhaled once, deeply anchoring herself, feeling the surge of history pressing against her ribs like a second heartbeat. Then she spoke the words that would be etched into the marble of memory forever. We, the so-called ghetto, we are not America's shame. We are its proof. Proof that the human spirit cannot be legislated into despair. Proof that no amount of walls, red lines, poisoned wells, or broken promises could kill the fire that was lit in us the first time someone said, "You are less." A gasp rippled through the visitors' gallery. Some hands went to mouths. Others tightened into fists. Across the chamber, several members of the Black Caucus rose silently to their feet, an unspoken salute, tears glittering in eyes that had seen too much to cry easily. "And I say to you now," Jasmine continued, voice steady, face shining with a righteous fire, "we will not carry your shame for you anymore. We will not lower our voices to make you comfortable. We will not apologize for daring to exist beyond the boxes you tried to bury us in." The silence that followed was not empty. It was electric. It was alive. It was the silence of an empire feeling its foundation shift beneath its feet. She ended with a final, thunderous declaration, one that would be replayed on news channels, stitched into TikTok videos, printed on T-shirts, and taught in classrooms long after the names of most politicians in that room were forgotten. We did not come from ghettos. We were forced into them. And we, those same children you tried to erase, built a nation from the ashes of your cruelty, with nothing but our bare hands and our hearts that refused to surrender. She stepped back from the podium then, but the words hung in the chamber like a living thing, vibrating through stone and skin alike. No one moved. No one spoke. Jasmine Crockett stood alone, but she had pulled the whole damn country into that silence with her, and for once the silence told the truth. And outside, across America, in living rooms and classrooms and bus stops and churches, millions of people whispered the same thing under their breath, as if afraid the dream might vanish if they said it too loud. Finally someone had said it, and finally there would be no going back. But Jasmine's words didn't just echo through the marble halls. They detonated across the country like a shockwave, turning public outrage into a tidal force Congress could no longer afford to ignore. It began within hours. First came the op-eds, blistering in their urgency. Major newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, ran front-page demands for congressional accountability, for real, measurable change, not the usual cycle of outrage, apology, and amnesia. Headlines screamed from kiosks and phone screens. Congress must confront its complicity. No more excuses for abandoning minority communities. Jasmine Crockett's truth demands action. Then came the calls. Hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands of calls flooding into congressional offices. Assistants and interns scrambled to keep up, their desks drowning in voicemails and emails, their hands shaking from the unrelenting pace. Constituents who had never called Washington before jammed the switchboards, their voices quivering with anger and heartbreak. No more empty promises, they demanded. No more pretending the system isn't rigged. Some calls were tearful, some were furious. All were crystal clear. Something fundamental had snapped, and there would be no stitching it back together with platitudes. Petitions rocketed across social media, gathering millions of signatures in days. Protesters massed outside district offices, carrying signs painted hastily overnight. Fund justice, not injustice. Red lines still bleed. We are not your scapegoats. The images poured across television screens, grainy and furious. Teenagers locking arms with elderly marchers, young mothers hoisting babies on their shoulders, all moving with the grim determination of people who understood that survival was no longer enough. They wanted dignity. They wanted investment. They wanted what had been systematically stolen for generations. Inside Congress, the pressure built like water behind a crumbling dam. Committee chairs found themselves ambushed by reporters outside bathrooms, cornered in elevators, chased down hallways lined with flashing cameras and shouted questions. No one wanted to be the face of inaction. No one wanted their name attached to the old machinery of indifference now exposed so nakedly to the world. For the first time in decades, bills that had languished in committee drawers gathered sudden, frantic attention. Proposals for minority business grants, educational equity funding, redistricting reforms, and housing reparations were yanked out of obscurity and thrust onto urgent legislative calendars. Staffers burned through the night, drafting amendments, rewriting language, scrubbing old loopholes that had once quietly gutted reforms before they could threaten real change. The Democratic leadership, sensing the wildfire at their backs, issued a formal statement within 72 hours, pledging to re-examine and strengthen federal support for historically marginalized communities. It was cautious, it was calculated, but it was a start. For the first time in a generation, federal funding tied directly to systemic correction, not just charity, not just aid, was on the table, and everyone knew why. On the Republican side, fractures widened into open chasms. A few moderates, reading the temperature of a furious public, broke ranks and issued timid endorsements of targeted community investments. They were immediately attacked by hardliners who accused them of surrendering to race-baiting politics. The party's internal emails leaked within days, showing chaotic messaging debates, desperate attempts to find language that could placate their base without looking like they were siding with Boebert's collapse. But the most telling reaction came not from politicians, but from corporate America and local governments, now terrified of being seen on the wrong side of the moment. Cities like Atlanta, Detroit, and Oakland announced emergency funding reviews for minority communities. Fortune 500 companies issued statements vowing to partner with underrepresented neighborhoods, some sincere, others laughably transparent, but all of them proof that Jasmine's impact had torn through the comfortable barriers that once insulated power from consequence. Congress, for once, had no choice but to move, or be crushed under the movement gathering outside their marble gates. Behind closed doors, lawmakers who had once rolled their eyes at equity initiatives now whispered urgently about drafting legislation before the next election cycle. Consultants ran frantic polls that confirmed their worst fears. Jasmine Crockett's speech had shifted public opinion more powerfully than any coordinated political campaign in years. Suburban mothers, long seen as the ultimate swing vote, now cited systemic racism as a top national concern, a phrase that had barely registered in their vocabulary 6 months earlier. Even conservative talk shows struggled to contain the flood. Hosts who tried to frame the uproar as wokeness run amok found themselves hammered by call-in guests who spoke of cousins denied mortgages, grandfathers who never got the GI Bill, sisters passed over for promotions. The narrative had cracked, and no amount of spin could patch it. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett refused to grandstand. She refused to bask. She refused to let her moment be reduced to a meme or a slogan. Instead, she moved quietly but relentlessly, sitting with policy advisors, drafting proposals rooted not in symbolism, but in substance. She knew better than anyone. Speeches cracked walls, but only laws rebuilt the foundations. When she reappeared on the House floor days later, carrying a thick binder titled simply, "The Equity Restoration Act," the entire chamber fell silent, not out of courtesy, but out of recognition. This was not a symbol. This was not a martyr. This was the future knocking on the door, louder and louder. With every second, the old guard refused to answer. And outside, in cities choked with history and hope, in classrooms and kitchens and street corners, America waited. Not patiently, not politely, but with the fierce electric hunger of a people who had finally been told the truth out loud and would no longer settle for anything less. As the wave of public pressure reshaped the halls of power, the spotlight turned inevitably toward the woman who had lit the match. And Jasmine Crockett, whether she welcomed it or not, was pulled onto the center stage of an America gasping for honesty. The offers came like a flood. CNN, MSNBC, ABC, even networks that had once ignored her now begged for her presence, their producers using words like historic and urgently needed in their frantic emails. Morning shows, primetime interviews, town hall specials. Everyone wanted Jasmine Crockett, not the polished, carefully coached sound bites of a typical politician, but her, the unfiltered, unstoppable force who had cracked open a national wound and refused to let it scab over with false comfort. At first, she hesitated. Jasmine knew what media could do, how it could twist, how it could soften the blow until the truth sounded like just another talking point. But as she watched the calls for action swell in the streets, young people painting her words on posters, elders quoting her speech at vigils, mothers clutching their children a little tighter with pride instead of fear, she realized this was no longer about her comfort. It never had been. So she said yes. The first appearance was on CNN's State of the Union. Jasmine stepped onto the set in a dark navy suit. No flashy jewelry, no dramatic colors, letting her presence, her bearing, carry the moment. Across from her, the veteran anchor leaned in, eyes wide, a stack of bullet-pointed questions trembling slightly in his hands. But before he could even get through the first query, Jasmine took the moment for what it truly was: a battlefield. She spoke not of herself, but of history. She spoke of ghettos not as a personal failure, but as a policy weapon. She wove statistics with stories, raw, painful, real, drawing a line between the children locked out of opportunity today and the families fenced out of prosperity for generations. Her voice never wavered. She did not sugarcoat. She did not pivot. She held the nation's gaze and said in effect, "You will not look away this time." The clip of her first response hit social media before the segment even finished airing. Millions watched Jasmine's steady gaze, her fierce clarity, her refusal to play to the camera. Young activists stitched her words into videos overlaid with images of protests, murals, graduation ceremonies rising out of broken neighborhoods. Parents sent the clip to their children. Teachers played it in classrooms, usually filled with silence on subjects too painful to teach. Then came MSNBC, where Jasmine sat across from Rachel Maddow, who for once looked less like a commentator and more like a witness to something bigger than any election cycle. Jasmine's voice, rich and unhurried, reached through the screen like a hand pulling America into a conversation it had spent lifetimes avoiding. She didn't ask for pity. She demanded respect. She demanded accountability. And she did it without raising her voice, because the truth, when spoken plainly enough, did not need to shout. Across the country, young people saw something in her they hadn't seen in years, maybe ever. A leader who wasn't interested in navigating the system to survive it. A leader ready to tear the system down and rebuild it around principles older and fiercer than any party platform. Students at Howard, at Spelman, at dozens of historically black colleges held watch parties, cheering every time Jasmine refused to let an interviewer steer her into politeness. Every time she leaned forward and said, in essence, "You owe us more than words. You owe us justice." But it wasn't just the students. It was the barbershop owners who stayed open late to blast her interviews on mounted TVs. It was the nurses huddled around break room screens on overnight shifts. It was the construction crews leaning against unfinished walls at lunch, nodding silently as she spoke, seeing their own stolen chances reflected in her every syllable. Jasmine was no longer just a congresswoman. She had become a vessel, a living, breathing testimony to what survival, brilliance, and righteous fury could build when denied everything else. Networks tried to book her again and again, but she was careful now. She chose interviews where she could speak fully, where her words wouldn't be chopped into neat, palatable sound bites. And she made one thing ruthlessly clear every time she appeared. This was not about one woman's courage. It was about one nation's debt. By her fourth televised appearance, even late-night hosts, usually content to lob easy jokes at politicians, spoke her name with a kind of reverence usually reserved for moments when comedy must step aside for gravity. Trevor Noah called her the voice America needed but didn't deserve. Samantha Bee played her entire speech uncut, breaking her show's usual rhythm because, as she said bluntly, some truths you don't interrupt. Meanwhile, on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, the undercurrent roared louder. Jasmine's speech became a rallying cry for a generation exhausted by hashtags that led nowhere and promises that dissolved in the next news cycle. They didn't just quote her, they moved with her. Organizers built campaigns around her words. High schoolers designed projects inspired by her legislative proposals. College students flooded her office with internship requests, not because they wanted resume lines, but because they believed truly for the first time that change might be possible if they put their hands on the wheel too. In less than a month, Jasmine Crockett's name had shifted from a trending topic to a symbol, a standard held high by those who understood that fighting injustice wasn't about waiting for the right moment. It was about making the moment happen with the sheer, stubborn will to refuse being erased. Yet even amid the momentum, Jasmine refused to let the spotlight seduce her. She reminded every interviewer, every panel, every town hall audience. The goal was not her fame. The goal was the dismantling of a system designed to pretend equality had already arrived, while inequality flourished in every corner, too uncomfortable to televise. She ended one appearance on national TV not with a slogan, but with a challenge. Don't just cheer. Don't just retweet. Don't just cry. Building push, vote, demand. Refuse to leave this country the way you found it. The clip racked up 20 million views in 48 hours. And somewhere between the blinking cameras and the roaring crowds, Jasmine Crockett, the girl they tried to chain with a single word, became something much bigger than a politician. She became a reckoning, and the nation, ready or not, would have to answer. Yet as Jasmine's star blazed higher, the same fire scorched everything in its path. And for Lauren Boebert, there would be no shelter from the reckoning she had ignited with her own careless hand. At first, the blowback came like a cold current, subtle but unmistakable, a tightening of smiles, a hardening of gazes, a shifting of support that Boebert, in her arrogance, had thought she could weather. But soon the current turned into a riptide, dragging her reputation into a storm she couldn't outtalk, outspin, or outsmirk her way out of. Within days of the hearing, the headlines sharpened from controversy to condemnation. Newspapers that had once given her the benefit of the doubt ran front pages that pulled no punches. Boebert's disrespectful rhetoric draws nationwide rebuke. A new low in congressional decorum. Community leaders in black neighborhoods who had once dismissed her as a loud but irrelevant nuisance now spoke her name with a new cutting contempt. Pastors in Baltimore, Atlanta, Detroit, stood before packed congregations and denounced her words as symptomatic of a system that saw black resilience not as triumph, but as a target. Civic organizations that usually stayed clear of partisan warfare issued statements directly calling out her behavior, refusing to let the moment be sanitized or forgotten. It wasn't just symbolic. Donations to Boebert's re-election campaign from minority donors, already low, plummeted to near zero. Endorsements she had quietly courted from diversity coalitions and independent voter outreach groups dissolved overnight. Some rescinded their support publicly, releasing scathing letters that were picked up by national media. We cannot, in good conscience, stand beside a leader who disrespects the communities she claims to represent. The numbers told a story even her loudest defenders couldn't spin away. Internal Republican polling leaked within a week, showing her favorability among black voters had cratered into single digits, lower than any sitting member of Congress in recent history. Even more devastating, her support among independent voters, especially suburban moderates critical for any future elections, collapsed by 23 points, a political freefall almost unheard of outside of full-blown scandals. Boebert tried to pivot. She staged awkward photo ops with minority business owners, some of whom looked visibly uncomfortable standing next to her. She issued a mealy-mouthed non-apology, claiming her words had been misunderstood and that she respected all communities. But the public was no longer interested in half-truths smoothed over by smiling press releases. The internet immortalized her gaffe with merciless efficiency. TikTokers layered her desperate interviews with clips of Jasmine's speech, drawing brutal contrast between Boebert's squirming evasions and Crockett's unflinching precision. Memes flooded timelines. A photo of Boebert captioned, "When you realize ignorance isn't as cute as you thought." Viral videos stitched her fumbled excuses into reels of mockery that racked up millions of views overnight. The damage wasn't just cultural, it became structural. Congressional Black Caucus members who had once treated her like a nuisance now openly moved to isolate her legislatively. Bipartisan committees she had lobbied to join quietly rescinded their offers. Bills she sponsored died without hearings. Proposals she attached her name to found themselves mysteriously tabled, filed away, suffocated without ceremony. Meanwhile, her Republican colleagues grew colder, some muttering behind closed doors about her being a liability heading into an already precarious election season. Senior GOP aides leaked internal memos describing her as radioactive among key demographics. A few hardliners defended her, framing her as a martyr for free speech, but their voices were drowned beneath the roar of a country that had finally had enough of cruelty disguised as candor. At town halls in her own district, Boebert faced something she hadn't prepared for. Anger not from the left, but from the middle. The independents and soft conservatives who now saw her not as a scrappy fighter, but as an embarrassing symbol of everything broken in modern politics. One mother stood up, voice shaking, and demanded to know how Boebert planned to rebuild trust after disrespecting so many Americans. A veteran in the back row folded his arms and asked why someone who can't respect the people she serves should expect their votes. Boebert, once quick with a quip or a snarl, faltered. Her answers grew defensive, brittle, her once crowd-pleasing sarcasm landing like stones in an empty well. She smiled, but the smiles looked painful now, forced, brittle under the crushing weight of consequences she couldn't joke away. And while she scrambled to patch the holes in her sinking ship, Jasmine Crockett soared across television screens, social media feeds, and town halls nationwide. Not gloating, not mocking, but building, stone by stone, a new foundation of visibility, respect, and truth that Boebert's clumsy insults had only served to accelerate. In the end, it wasn't Jasmine who destroyed Boebert's standing. It was Boebert herself, armed with nothing but arrogance, ignorance, and a fatal underestimation of a people who had survived far greater wounds than a badly aimed insult. And as the dust settled, one fact became brutally clear to every strategist, every voter, every fading ally in Washington. Lauren Boebert had not just lost a moment. She had lost the future. But beyond the victories and the ruins left behind, something deeper remained. A truth harder than any headline. A lesson written not in speeches or applause, but in blood, struggle, and the unbreakable will to rise. But after the thunder faded and the headlines shifted, one lesson burned hotter and clearer than anything else. A truth no one who witnessed Jasmine's stand could ever forget. Jasmine Crockett's story was never just about one confrontation. It was about the brutal, undeniable truth that dignity isn't handed out by the powerful. It's seized by those who refuse to be erased. She showed a nation addicted to denial that injustice isn't only written in blood. It's carved silently into policies, into boardrooms, into everyday words meant to humiliate and control. She didn't just demand respect. She forced America to see the violence in the structures it calls normal. Her voice became a beacon for those told to wait, to behave, to hope quietly while doors slammed in their faces. Through her, an entire generation learned that survival is not surrender. It is resistance. It is power. She proved that progress isn't polite. It's defiant. That change doesn't come when the powerful are comfortable. It comes when the uncomfortable refuse to sit down. Jasmine's stand wasn't only a defense of her name, it was a defense of every forgotten name, every silenced cry, every stolen dream. And in that moment, she didn't just speak for herself, she cracked open history and demanded a future built from truth, not from fear. When the final echoes of her words faded, they left something far more lasting. A country forced, at least for a moment, to reckon with what it means to fight. not just to survive, but to finally be seen. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.